Hi, everyone. I'm back again with another Balsamiq design process interview. Today I have Justin from YAC and SoFriendly here to talk about his design process. So welcome, Justin. Please introduce yourself and tell us about your background.
Yeah, my background is startups. I've been working at startups since I was 16. Got hired in high school. Kind of had that unique life as a high school student of having a history exam in the morning and be shipping product to a customer at 2 a.m. the night before, which not a lot of my friends really had to deal with. But it was something that I got introduced very early to. So yeah, I did UI UX design for them. I kind of dabbled a little bit in development. I learned a lot about like embedded and IoT. We're building a in-dash car stereo system for an electric car before Tesla was really Tesla. It was another company out in California. Learned a lot while I was there. You know, it's a startup, so you learn kind of on the job, and everybody wears many hats.
Yeah.
So I was a designer, but I was also a developer, but I was also a product designer and a manager, and all those things kind of combined. I worked at a couple startups kind of in college, and then I had an idea for my own product, and I pitched it to the old CEO from that very first company, and he thought it was a cool idea. And so we pitched it to another guy and kind of formed a little startup, raised a couple $1 million, and then we actually took that company public about 5 years later. So we IPO'd, and there's stock on the stock market and all that jazz. But I learned a lot while I was at that company, just about user experience design, product market fit, product design in general, kind of the importance of talking to your customers. And I spun out of that company, created a design agency called SoFriendly. And that's where I've met my co-founders for YAC. I brought them in very early on in SoFriendly, and we built a lot of products for other companies and SaaS products, mobile apps, did everything from branding all the way up to full development and design. And, we're just kind of turning that around now and focusing on our own product with all the principles that we were pushing on our customers.
That's really interesting. That's great. I can't wait to dig into all of that stuff. I browsed your website and I checked out a lot of your products, and they're really cool. Lots of different things, VR, AR in there, and
Lots of different, yes.
lots of different great stuff. Very cool. So these videos are, intended for people who are either not designers, so they're developers or product owners or product people, or people who are new to design and are interested in it. So my first question is always, what is your design process?
Yeah, I mean, it's a big blanket question, right? There's a lot to unwrap in that. I think one of the first things from a design process perspective is requirements. Just what's the scope of this new step? Even if it's coming from an agency background, if we look at a client scope, whether that's an entire mobile app or a set of features that they want to add to the mobile app, I think you kind of approach it from the same perspective, which is let's break down what the requirements are. And a lot of the ways that we do that is actually starting with wireframing. Whether that's simply, as a startup, just doing it on a whiteboard very quickly, just start drawing stuff on a whiteboard and throwing stuff together. You wouldn't believe the number of times that we'll go to add a feature to YAC and we'll start whiteboarding it really quickly and realize, oh my gosh, like this totally breaks like a million different things. Like trying to implement this feature is going to break UI elements, or it's going to cause a flow that all of a sudden is going to cause a break in another flow that we had created. And you're always thinking also, 2 steps ahead, right? Like we've got a couple sprints that are being worked on right now. What is this feature going to do that might break things that aren't even live currently? So yeah, we typically start with kind of just sketching stuff out on a whiteboard, putting it in front of the team, making sure that we're all on the same page when it comes to how the thing's going to be built out. From there, a lot of times we'll dive into wires. Sometimes we skip wires if it's something for YAC and we already have all of our visual design already built out in like a really nice sketch file or something. For clients, we typically always did wires as a first step. Low fidelity, black and white. One of the main things that we learned early on was no matter how many times you tell a client that they are wires, they will think that my app is going to be black and white. It's going to have this weird sketchy look to it. No, that doesn't follow our design style. So we started doing really low fidelity ones that were just like boxes and squares and circles for buttons, just to like give it to them and say, all right, does this cover all the bases, right? Are all the features that you asked us to get in here, do you see them accounted for, right? And that's kind of our first step is bouncing it back to, either whoever came up with this feature inside of YAC, or if it was a client, bouncing it back to them and saying, hey, just make sure everything's accounted for. Are all the buttons, on the screen? Don't pay attention to necessarily even where they are, but just make sure that you can get to, feature A, B, and C from this screen. And then from a process perspective, we typically dive into like mood boards, or go straight into visual design and mock up out of whatever we think is maybe the central screen for whatever we're working on. If it's a website, maybe it's the homepage. If it's a mobile app, maybe it's the tab that feature lives on. What is that going to look like? What's the visuals look like? And that gives us a base to kind of start the rest of the design process from.
Yeah, that's really interesting. There's a lot to unpack there. Thank you.
Sure.
What's interesting, and I think people should note, is when you're designing something for yourself, you're building a product, you're a product designer. A lot of times, like you said, you have an established design pattern, so you don't need to sort of over communicate by creating lots of documentation like wireframes. Like a sketch on a whiteboard will then be implemented into the design through code typically, which I think is like how it should be. It's quick and you're testing it and you need to move quickly. But what I think is really interesting is what you said about communicating with a client, someone who is external from your team and, doesn't have maybe a sense of the overall big picture like you do.
Yeah.
So you have to really communicate. That was great. I think it's interesting too that you mentioned mood boards, because that's another sort of quick way to communicate higher fidelity to external sources.
Yeah, and I think clients in general also, they typically communicate best with, I saw this thing that I liked here. Could you make it look like this? Mm-hmm. And a lot of times it's, when they pick it, you're like, I don't know what you like about this. This is so far away from what you've explained to me that you need. Is it the colors? Is it the style? Is it the UI controls? Like, you're not being specific. And so if we can kind of take a jump on that and be the ones that create the mood board and explain ahead of time, like, what do you think of these colors? And just have a colors mood board. That way they don't get distracted by everything else, right? And we have like, what do you think of this like list view, right? And have a mood board of all the different types of ways to show a list. Then when you present it to them, you kind of have the power and you get to control what they're seeing, versus a lot of times it's, oh, well, show me something you like. And then they send you something and you're like, this isn't going to work at all. This isn't even like the same realm of functionality. What do you even like about this? So yeah, mood boards are a good step for us because it gives us back the power and allows us to put things in place that, we think probably look cool. Like, we don't make mood boards of stuff that we don't like, right? We pick the stuff ourselves and we're excited to build whatever they pick out of it. So yeah, it prevents them from picking something that just isn't going to work.
Yeah, that's a great idea. I'm going to highlight that with a little star in my notes. Thank you.
There you
go. So my next question is, and it's something that you touched on, and I think it's important to talk about, is your process for designing something new, so a new product or a new website, versus enhancing an existing product. So that would be like you mentioned, adding a new feature and how it works into the current.
Yeah, I mean, one of the base things is just like with the product like YAC, if you've done your job correctly as a designer, we have an amazing like sketch library of components, right? And the icons are already made and the thickness of the lines on those icons are already determined and the color palette's already made. So when we go to create a new feature, if we've done our job well enough, you can just kind of insert, and build a page from a set of symbols. And we didn't really have to work that hard to get there, because essentially you want to be reusing the same components. You want the layout styles to be the same. Even when it comes to our website, if you can just plop some sections down that mimic maybe what's on the homepage, you at least get 50% there. And so a lot of what we'll do is make sure that our files are set up in such a way that it's very easy to just insert symbols and kind of build from that. But yeah, when it's something totally different, you have to create all of that stuff first. And that's why we start with like those mood boards and then move into maybe some basic component design. A lot of what we actually do with wireframes as well is, if it's a client that I know is going to react a certain way to wireframes. What we'll typically do is actually start our wireframes just purely in Sketch, as just like gray boxes, and then layer the visual literally on top of that. Or if we've done wireframes in another app, a lot of times we'll export them as just, PNGs, throw them into Sketch, and layer visual elements over top of them. So we even use the wireframes not as a base of this is what the app's going to look like. It's literally a base for the actual components. So, having all of that stuff on your docket that you have to take care of is a very large task to overcome that, a good startup should build that stuff at the beginning, have those components throughout the life cycle of adding new features. But for a new product, you don't have any of that. It doesn't exist yet. So that's why we kind of take that approach differently, where if it's even a feature that most of the stuff's already been built out in code, yeah, we'll just do like a simple mock of it, maybe just like one screen to show a developer what it needs to look like, and then just hand that off. We don't need to do, insane amounts of, iterations just to get to that if it's all just reusing the same components. Something that I found recently, especially with YAC, is some of these features that we've been doing, I guess, are hard to explain over, text. Hey, we're building like a voice tool. This is exactly, we're all big on this idea that like just typing something into a task management system doesn't usually actually explain how you want it done. And so for design process, we've actually started doing small animations. We already have all the design elements made. They're in our sketch file. And so a lot of times we'll just quickly import those into Principle and just do like a really, really rough, not sexy, not going to be on a website by any means, animated GIF of what we want like a swipe animation to do. We recently introduced a pinch gesture on the list. You can pinch the list to filter to unread messages. And explaining the kind of like micro interactions that you want there is really complicated. So we just made a really quick GIF. We already had a list view of what it looked like. So we just did a couple frames of how we wanted the pinch gesture to look. And then we actually attached that to the task. So the designer is not actually designing anything new there, but they're almost, again, it's about that requirement, really, really fleshing out that requirement. And a lot of times I'll have the designer do that just so that when the developer gets that task, they're like, I get it. That's exactly how it should work. It should work exactly like this. Simple stuff with a gesture, you need to tell a developer, activate the gesture at 60% of that slide, right? And if you don't tell them that, they'll just make up a random number, right? They'll just find some number they think is fine. But if you do your work correctly and you do that animated GIF, they can look at it and estimate, okay, when it gets to this section of the screen, that's when the action should be taking place. So yeah, a lot of times we'll do that to even kind of speed up that process instead of just saying, hey, implement this feature.
Yeah, that's great. That's really interesting. One thing that I was thinking of when you're talking too is designing for mobile and, touch. Designing for touch is a lot different than designing for click. And it's more of like the subtleties like you're mentioning really need to be on point. But that brought me to another question, and I was wondering if you would be interested in covering what tools you use. So you mentioned Sketch and Principle and, obviously code, but so what's your process there?
Yeah, definitely. Well, we are Balsamiq users. So that's actually on the SoFriendly side, that's even listed in our proposal documents. That's what we use for wireframes. Sketch, we present a lot of stuff in Envision. A lot of times we also use Overflow, which is a newer tool. Overflow it takes a lot of work, in my opinion, to actually put one together. But what we found, especially for handoff to dev teams, is that Overflow gives them that big picture where they can zoom out and see just how all the lines are connected. Because a lot of times a developer just needs to know, how do I get from A to C? Like, what's the path there? And so having that flow chart is super helpful for them. So we'll present to either developer teams or to clients in Envision or Overflow. Actually, on the website, a lot of times we use Pastel. I don't know if you've ever heard of them. Oh. It's like Envision commenting, but for fully coded websites. Oh. One thing that we found is that, this isn't a knock to a developer, but a lot of times, and Ming too talks about this as well, is this idea of designers should be coding their own designs because only they know how it should truly look, and just developers aren't going to care that much about those micro things that a designer, loves those details. But a lot of times it's not practical, and a developer is the one that needs to be implementing something on the front end. And what we found for sure is just there's always like a slight discrepancy between the mock-up we did in InVision, especially when it comes to web, right, and the actual website, especially responsive design, right? If we didn't do the responsive mock and the dev just did some very standard, responsive, media queries, we use Pastel to actually drop comments on very specific sections and say, at 30% width, like this isn't dropping down and it needs to, or this font size is too big, or, this header image needs to be a little bit darker, whatever it may be. And we can just drop comments all over the page. So Pastel's been really useful for us. On the design side itself, we typically stick with Sketch, although I've been super impressed with XD lately. Really impressed with what they've been doing. We're building a plugin for XD called Draft XR, which is for that VR stuff we talked about at the beginning.
Totally going to try it out. I can't wait to try it out.
It's cool. And XD is enabling things like that. And they're, I think they're on the up and up for maybe overtaking Sketch pretty soon. Like the auto animate features are just so cool. Very, very cool to be able to click 2 buttons and have something spin and not have to worry about diving into something like Principle for designs or for animations. Yeah, and then Principle's new. We just started using that maybe like 2 months ago. And it's been interesting getting into that because there's a lot of things that I thought would work a certain way, and they definitely don't. One of those just being the sketch import. I definitely always thought that it like imported the actual sketch file and that you could manipulate it, but it really just like builds bitmaps off of your artboards. And so you have to like edit and then re-import and edit and re-import. But the ability to quickly get a movie or a GIF out of that is far superior to any of the other animation tools we've used.
That's really cool. Total side note, but one thing I've found interesting about XD is that you can do conversational design with it now too.
Yeah.
I was like, way to go, Adobe. I was pretty surprised by Adobe, doing a lot of good things. It's terrible to say.
No, but they actually stopped by our office and they demoed a bunch of this stuff to us, and we were not XD users. Like, I think I used the beta when it first came out, and when they left, we were like, oh my God, we might switch. Like, this got awesome very quickly.
That's great. I'm gonna have to try it. I'm excited to. I don't really design much anymore, so I'll have to find a problem to solve.
I know that feel.
Yeah. Great. This is great stuff, Justin. Thank you. So my next question is, I'm kind of taking a step back, and it's sort of saying, you create your own products. So how do you come from, or how do you generate product ideas, or maybe might be better is you have a product idea, you're doing ideation. How do you take the ideas and move it to design?
Well, I think the first step there is prioritizing, right? There's a lot of ideas, especially in a company that's just filled with a bunch of creatives, right? Like we have ideas every day, but the first step is figuring out where does that lie along the path of our priorities for the company, for the product? Where does it fit into the backlog of existing ideas? So a lot of that has to do with just prioritizing it. After that, once you've figured out, okay, this is something we need to move on, assigning it to the right people. Again, we usually whiteboard it very quickly just to figure out if it's even going to work. And then we'll try and do some sort of like cost analysis on it. This is something that I think we're trying to get better at as a startup that doesn't have necessarily, like with an agency, your cost analysis is kind of one-to-one. Like if you've done your job correctly and either it's an hourly job or it's a fixed price job, you can figure out, okay, this fits into the scope or it doesn't fit into the scope because it's someone else's project. When it's your own project, now you're burning your own money and you have to figure out, like, do we pay for this? Do we not pay for this? Who do we assign to this? And I think one thing that a lot of people know about us as a team is we're very focused, but at the same time, we love doing side projects. And all of that has to do with kind of that end goal of where we want to be. And a lot of people definitely have reached out and said, like, man, how do you pull that off? Like, how do you guys go off and do something like Backtrack while you're building something like YAC? And a lot of that has to do with resourcing. Many times I'll pull in like a contractor that's done some work for us in the past that I know is very good. I'll have them quote out something at like a fixed price, like, hey, here's our requirements. It's not going to change. This is exactly what we need. And we just need it done in like 2 weeks, right?
Yeah.
Then I'll go give that to a contractor and have them build it out. And that way we haven't distracted the existing dev team. We're not pulling away from design resources that are supposed to be doing something else. And I can kind of manage that myself. So even the rest of the internal team isn't being pulled away from the core product. But yeah, I mean, when it's your own feature, that cost analysis is a big part early on of figuring that out. And I think we're getting better at it. But just trying to figure out the impact. And cost has so many levels to it. It's not just monetary, right? It's time cost, it's effort, it's drain on the company or your brain even. And so you have to figure out, like, is this a 1 week feature? Is this a 2 week feature? Is this a everyone is going to have to work on this for a year to figure it out type of feature, right? Like, you know, I'm casually throwing ideas about how we could implement machine learning in YAC, right? And there's a lot of cool stuff there. But then you have to kind of temper it down and bring it back to reality and go, okay, if we did that, we would have to like completely focus on that for a very long time. And there's much higher priority things right now. But yeah, I think once you do that cost analysis and you figure out, okay, this is something that is easily achievable. It's not going to distract us too much. It's not going to pull away from some core feature that we're going to implement. Then it's just about assigning the right resources and, you know, ensuring that it gets out of that backlog into the priority. So like our Asana, which is what we use for task management right now, is very simple. I am a huge fan of not creating noise for the sake of noise. And so a lot of what we do is just try and simplify as many processes as we can. So our Asana is literally just like backlog and priority. That's it. There's no to do, done, doing. Yeah. As soon as it's done, I just check it off, right? Now the QA team has their own like test plan that they will go through to make sure that when something's done, that it's truly done, and they can move it out of confirmed into another slot for QA purposes. But for my own sanity and the dev team sanity, we keep the task management system very simple, right? And a lot of times it's just putting something in priority, watching the fact that that is definitely not going to get done in the next couple of days, and moving it right back into backlog. And what's nice is that it stays there, and that me moving it is also kind of like an internal reminder to go, okay, this other task that I had in priority ended up being a little bit longer. We won't be able to get to these backlog features quite as soon as we thought we would, you know, be able to. But that process is very simple in just saying, I am deprioritizing this. I'm moving into the backlog. And as soon as we knock 1 or 2 features out of the priority, I'll move it right back out, right? And that's happened, you know, to certain features maybe 3 or 4 times. We want to get emoji quick replies in YAC just so that someone can send a quick thumbs up when they complete a task, or they say, yeah, I understand what you said. They just don't need to send a voice message back for that. And a lot of that has been priority. Oh boy, that's not getting touched at all this week. Move it back to backlog. All right, this is the week we're going to do it. Move it into priority. Okay, it wasn't this week. Product Hunt Makers Festival happened this week. I guess we're going to move that back to backlog. And yeah, as of yesterday, I think I moved it back to priority.
That's interesting. I love that. That's a great. I did want to touch on one thing that you said that I loved, and it's about cost analysis is more than money, and burnout is real. And it's a big part of, people have to understand that you can't solve creative problems continuously all the time and never stop without not doing well, you know, without suffering performance issues. So I think that's really interesting to add on top of, you know, even the more, you know, the money and all that. So very cool. So I think now I kind of just want to focus more talking about wireframing, and sort of, I know you talked about it at the beginning, and maybe we can just touch on it again. But how does wireframing fit into your process?
Yeah, I mean, I guess just what I can also even do is just general tips on wireframing as well. And
That's
it gets into the process early on. So it's one of the first steps we ever take, especially a lot of times, even with on the agency side, what we used to do is if the client came to us with what I would call a piss poor requirement, right? Like just, I'm going to build the next Facebook. And you're like, okay, that's a thing. Sure. We understand what Facebook is. Can we break that down a little bit further? Right. One of the first things we would offer is if they came in like that, especially if they were pushing for fixed price, they didn't want to do hourly, we would say, all right, tell you what, let's do like a small $2,500 discovery phase. And as part of that, what we'll do is wireframes. We'll wireframe the whole thing out, every screen. And we'll give that to you as a take home. If we come back and offer you a price that's just way out of range of what you think you can pay, hey, you get to take the wireframes home. That's something you can take to another dev shop who's cheaper than us. And you say, hey, I already had a dev team do all of the wireframes for you. This is the requirement. And so a lot of times that's actually one of the first steps that we would do with a customer during that discovery phase is just blowing out all the wires for them. And then they get to have that as a take home. And they can take that to any other dev shop. We don't mind. That's okay. They need that. They need to have those as requirements. A lot of times that's what we'll even do for someone who's not ready to build yet and they just want to do some design work is we'll say, let's start with just the wires. And if you're happy with working with us for, the next, 2 weeks or whatever it takes to get the wires done, then we'll move into visuals, but we'll have a base that we can work off of instead of working off of zero. So yeah, I mean, wires are essential to the very first step. I do them a little bit differently than I think a lot of other companies do. If it's a very complex app, but there's only, a couple core features to it, we will only do like high level wires. Like I don't do, 75 screens of wires a lot of times. We'll do the home screen, feature 1 and feature 2, right? Like maybe 5 wires total. And we'll say, hey, how do these look? What do you think about tab navigation? Or what do you think about, hamburger menu navigation? Like the wires will give you enough fidelity to see, oh, no, I want all the actions at the bottom of the screen with icons and words. Or, yeah, putting them into a hamburger menu is great. Or something as simple as like, yeah, I love that Tinder swipe UI. That's perfect, right? They just get like a high-level understanding of how we're going to accomplish this, right? If it's an app that is maybe even a two-sided marketplace, like we just did one for, it's like Uber for maids. You can hire a maid and they'll come into your house and you have to say what services you want and they have to get an address and there's payment. I mean, it is pretty complex. We did wires for almost every screen on that one because there's 2 user types, right? You got the maid type and you got the actual customer. There's payment and money flowing between the 2. Like we want to make sure we don't miss anything between those. And so we did wires for everything and we'll present those typically in the tool that we build them in. So if it's like Balsamiq or if it's Flinto or any of those other tools that we used to use, presented in that. Otherwise, what we actually do is an Envision board. Envision board versus the actual Envision prototype is an important distinction. The reason why we use a board for like very early stuff is because you can see all the designs without having to hook up all the like clickable prototype stuff. A lot of times we'll do an Envision board because it's more high level, kind of like I was talking about why we do overflows, is you get that big picture, they get to see everything all at once. And that's sort of our first step is saying, make sure we accounted for everything. Make sure everything's, here. Another thing that I found, and I kind of touched on this earlier, is one of the biggest things I've had to explain to clients is this is not what your app will look like, right? Like, I don't know what it is about like the sketchy, hand-drawn look to wireframes, but everyone makes some weird assumption that that's how it's going to look. And so one of the things I always note is like, no, we do this on purpose. It looks like that for a reason. And it is because we don't want you to go in with some bias on color or style. So we've made it in this kind of exaggerated style so that you can just focus on the pure UX, pure functionality side of things. But I've definitely found that that's something, especially if you're a designer that's working with clients, that you have to explain. You really have to say, like, don't pay attention to the style. This is not going to stay this way. Just pretend it's whatever color you think it might be. I want you to focus exclusively on these two things. And having that note up front, it just saves you in the end. I can't tell you how many times we'll get comments on an Envision where they're like, yeah, I love this, but I didn't think that the app would be in black and white. We're like, oh my God, I forgot to give my notes at the very beginning again, I guess.
It's just funny. You just gave me an idea that we should create some sort of PSA for
yes, definitely,
for designers and people to use in pitch meetings.
Yep, absolutely. Yeah, there should be like a sticker sheet that just says, alert, this is not what your app will look like.
Totally. That's great. Awesome stuff. Thank you, Justin. So my final question is, and I think it's another important one, what do you do once, or what happens next when you launch your products or you launch a new feature? I think, and the reason why I typically ask this or at least mention this is a lot of times you're not done yet. So what does it look like once it's out in the wild?
I mean, I would further that and say you're never done, right? Like a product is never finished, right? There's always something more you can do. So a couple things. One would be just the general statement of you never learn if you don't ship. And, this is something I'm guilty of, especially as a CEO, of being overly perfectionist about my product. I come from a design background. So even if I'm not the one doing the actual designing, I look at whatever we put out as a reflection of my own work, right? And so I want to make sure this thing is perfect, right? But you never learn from your users if you don't ship something. And that pertains to a product, just shipping the product in general. And it also pertains to obviously like a feature release. And what we've definitely learned, especially on the startup side of things, is to just get stuff out there, see how people react to it, and then react quickly. Right? Like I think one of the superpowers that our team has is quick iteration cycles, and that we can throw something out there, we can get feedback, and then we can very quickly put a new version out there based off of feedback. But you would never even get to that step if you were being, overly picky about getting it launched. A lot of times what we've learned is, when you're being overly perfectionist about it, you've spent maybe, 50% of the time on stuff that you rip out anyway because they didn't end up liking that part that you spent all the extra time on. So yeah, shipping it is a huge part of just what you do when you're finished. Just get it out there, get that feedback. What we've started to do recently, especially on the startup side, is that iteration cycle is now interviews. We're doing these case study kind of questionnaires where we go find who our power users are and we say, how are you using it? Why are you using it? What's your team look like? What features do you like? What features do you feel are missing? And we just did this with a team last week, and the feedback was way different than I thought it was going to be. Like they were asking for all kinds of things that made no sense to me. And then when we finally got down to like how they were using it, I was like, I did not think of that use case at all. Like that is so far from how I thought someone would use YAC. But that's great. That's awesome. It makes sense. Like I get why you're using it for that. Let's figure out how we can prioritize some of that feedback and get that into the product. But yeah, a lot of it has to do with putting stuff out there, getting that feedback on it, prioritizing again, what are the features that reflect where we want the product to be and fit into the roadmap? Or are there features that maybe only 10% of our user base is going to use, but adding them doesn't really hurt anything, right? Like it doesn't impact, maybe it's just a setting, right? One of the things that we found very early on, and you'd think it would be obvious, but I guess maybe it wasn't, was people wanted to move the YAC icon around on the screen. We had it just like permanently docked bottom right, and you had like kind of an area that you could just scoot it around in case it was ever covering something. But what we found is that bottom right was a great place to default the icon. But then very quickly it was people wanted to move it to a second monitor. They wanted to move it to the top left. And then we had to do all this code to figure out if it's at the top, does it open from the bottom or does it open from the top? There was a lot of engineering that was just put into figuring out where the stupid thing is on the screen. But when we first launched it, we were like, yeah, just put it bottom right, it'll be fine. And like 90% of the users were like, no, I want full control over this. We're like, all right, that makes sense. Everyone said that though, we have to prioritize that feature, right? And then there's other features that people come back with and you're like, okay, yes, I get that. Let's see how we can fit that into a roadmap or see if other people say that. Let's put a vote feature, right? And then that gets deprioritized, but still noted. And so, yeah, I think one of the things that you can learn from feedback as well is also kind of where the market is shifting, especially when you're a product team. One of the things I always like to say about our team is that I think we have a pretty good pulse on the market. When we launch something, it's, you know, 2 current trends, people are excited about it, it makes sense. It's not, why did you launch this? It's, oh my God, I wish this existed sooner, right? And I think having that pulse on the market is a really important part of being a startup and building a product. And the best way to learn that is not only, you know, indulging yourself in news and Twitter and current trends, but it's also just talking to your customers, figuring out what they want, what they don't want, where they're using it, how they're using it. If there's something that we haven't even thought of and they're saying, yeah, this is a huge pain point, and you go find 5 other people have the exact same pain point, that makes you better as a product maker, because now you've got that pulse on the market and you know where things are shifting, what the trends are. And that's a huge part of just talking to your customers. And you don't learn that unless you ship something, right?
Yeah, that's so interesting. That's great. Well, that's all my questions for today. Thank you again for joining us. I'm really excited to get this out there and have people learn from you. So thanks again.
Man.
Awesome. Thank you. Nice to meet you.
Yeah, nice to meet you too, man. Talk to you later.
Bye.